Welcome to The Wire. I'm Chris, and this is Firewire Surfboards' platform for surfboard design, sustainability, social outreach, and of course, other fun surf-related stuff. Our guest today is someone who I'm pretty sure you're not yet familiar with, but I'm convinced he's someone you'll be thrilled to meet. He is Dr. Jess Ponting, and he is director of the Center for Surf Research at San Diego State University. He is also the co-founder of Stoke Certified, the world's first sustainability certification program for surf and ski tourism operators. So I'll break this down. What this means is that Jess spends his time dabbling in many surf destinations you've heard of, promoting environmental and social sustainability. Places like Papua New Guinea, Fiji, Indonesia, and more. And I think he's an exceptional example of how a person can align their career and work with their life interests and passions. Now, in this conversation you're about to hear, it does take us a few minutes to find our footing and get into a flow, but if you skip around, you'll find a lot of exciting things that will give you a fascinating view of the way that our actions as surfers in the ocean or at wave pools, which we do get into, have impacts both good and bad on everything around us. The last thing that I'll say is this. I think that you can best understand a teacher through the opinions of their students. So I will leave you with this quote from Ali Borelli. She's a former student at San Diego State, and she now manages the Scorpion Bay Hotel in Mexico. And she says that, quote, Jess's energy at SDSU has opened doors for many students in sustainable tourism management and helped many of us succeed in ways we hadn't imagined possible. He is a great dad as well, and after a beer or two, his dad jokes are as funny as dad jokes can get. Her words, not mine. Here is Dr. Jess Ponting. Jess, we're here in your office where you are the director for the Center for Surf Research at San Diego State University. Now, for your average surfer, that sounds like your job is to research surfing. It sounds pretty dreamy. What is the Center for Surf Research?
The Center for Surf Research is essentially a research center that was allowed to be put into place by San Diego State University at my request. My research looks at sustainability in surf tourism predominantly, and so it's housed within a school of hospitality and tourism, and it is predominantly involved with researching sustainable surf tourism, how it can be made more sustainable, how it can benefit local communities in destination countries, what policies need to be put in place at various levels of government to make that happen, and various theories and tools for testing and implementing sustainability in surf tourism. We also house the International Association of Surfing Academics through the Center for Surf Research, so it's more broad than just the tourism angle. We're interested in sustainability and research into surfing of all kinds.
And you mentioned communities. It seems like one of the pivotal moments in your life, or many of the pivotal moments in your life that led you here, happened while you were just traveling as a surfer years ago. You've said before that you saw communities that were supporting themselves through surf tourism, say, for example, in Papua New Guinea, but you said that you saw a lot of social and environmental costs that these communities and surf destinations had to endure in order to be able to make a living off of traveling surfers. Can you give us an example or two of what those social and environmental costs were that you saw as a traveling surfer and how they impacted you?
Sure. I guess to put the background in place really quickly, my first independent travels as a surfer through Indonesia came at the end of a year as a community development worker living in East Sepik province in Papua New Guinea, where a lot of what I'd been doing was putting into place what was at the time relatively new idea of ecotourism or sustainable tourism. Mm-hmm. So this is in the mid to late 1990s. There was already a great deal of work and decades of work done on community development work. Sustainable tourism had a large number of people beginning to look at it. The United Nations had Agenda 21, which was about environmental conservation. And so moves were afoot, and there was a lot of academic infrastructure to support the development of sustainable tourism. And when I finished up in Papua New Guinea with all of the knowledge of all of this infrastructure and went surfing in Indonesia for the better part of a year, it was disappointing to see the thing that I love doing, surfing, economically propping up communities, but taking advantage of none of this knowledge of how to develop businesses, essentially extract wealth from visiting people and turn it into good outcomes for local populations. None of that was being implemented, and I was kind of embarrassed and ashamed of what surfing was doing to some of these places that I was visiting. I remember the Lakey Peak area in central Sumbawa at the time. There was a lot of coastal erosion taking place from accommodations being built too close to the beach. There was a serious trash problem from the waste from visiting surfers not being disposed of, probably not directly littering, but not having any infrastructure to deal with the waste that was being generated. Inadequate sewage treatment. Often it was a septic tank right close to the beach, so any overflow was going straight into the water that we were surfing in. Local surfers, visiting surfers were not on their best behaviour when they were visiting. That much was clear. I mean, to an extent, I was one of them. But in what were formerly fairly conservative Muslim communities, people getting outrageously drunk, smuggling in marijuana, things that we might consider to be, fairly run-of-the-mill, but were not run-of-the-mill for conservative Muslim communities. And then also creating demand for prostitution. Lagundri Bay in the island of Nias off the west coast of Sumatra was another example in this period where general debauchery was following surf tourism around and not having great outcomes. The youth in these communities were aspiring to be like visiting surfers, and what they saw was a revolving door of people who seemed to have endless amounts of money, never seemed to work, surfed all the time, got drunk every night, took drugs and slept with prostitutes. And that's what their new life goals became, with no real way of achieving that, and not understanding that these folks on their very worst behaviour were really only doing that for a week or two, maybe a month, maybe 2 months, having worked the rest of the year to save up that money. They didn't kind of understand the full equation and how that life balance was achieved. So a lot of the places I was visiting in that time period, it was just kind of embarrassing to be a surfer and see the impact that was happening on these communities. Sure, they were getting money, but it was coming at a hefty cost.
Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of the ways that you've worked to address those issues, let me segue just for a minute back into those experiences that you had. I mean, you were born in the UK, you went to school in Australia, you also spent time living in Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, other places. For anyone listening who may have thoughts of moving abroad, living in a different country for extended periods like you've done, what advice do you have for those kinds of decisions? I mean, pulling the trigger on saying, I'm going to go live in country X for a year or a year and a half. How should particularly young people view those types of decisions, and what advice do you have for them?
Biggest piece of advice, I guess, is do it. I think it provides you with a different perspective on your own life. In terms of making it a success, I think you have to understand that if you're going to particularly remote places who maybe live in a traditional fashion, you have to understand that the knowledge and skills that you bring to the table are almost completely useless in those settings. And you have to be ready to be humbled on a daily basis, look like an idiot almost constantly, and learn from the ground up. You're like a child. And hopefully people who live in those places will take care of you and teach you how to survive where they survive effortlessly. And I've had it pointed out to me by people who live in the bush in Papua New Guinea that they would be lost in the middle of a city in the same way that I would die within a few days if I was abandoned in a forest in Papua New Guinea where they've been living for 80,000 years with no problem. So, and then having a sense of humour to be able to laugh at yourself and the situations around you is absolutely crucial.
So kind of be prepared to fall on your face a little bit and be ready to laugh at yourself and have a sense of humour for whatever tragedies befall you.
Yeah,
it sounds like.
And not just a little bit. You'll be on your face most of the time for the first, pretty much the whole time. It'll become more fun as time goes along. But I think those experiences are incredibly valuable, and I would encourage people to seek them out if they feel so inclined.
One other question on that topic. I mean, you're a professor. You don't just do research. You also actively teach. There's this debate that goes on about whether real-world traveling experience taking in culture is more useful than a standard academic education. Do you have an opinion on that? Do they both go hand in hand? Is one better than the other?
I think they're quite complementary, and I think both are probably equally valuable, but if you can combine the two in some way where your study informs your travel, or even better, if your travel is part of your study, then that becomes transformationally powerful as a learning experience.
Okay. We maybe we'll touch on some more of that because I think that's an interesting topic. But for now, let's kind of try to get deep into what you do with the Center for Surf Research. A lot of your time is spent helping to certify surf resorts as sustainable. So, for example, you just returned from Scorpion Bay Hotel last week, I think. Can you rattle off a short list of resorts that we may have heard of that you've certified? I think you said Tavarua is one of them. Am I right? And then what are a few more that you've certified that people may have heard of?
And not all of these are certified, but are benchmarked or in the process. So Tavarua has been certified for some time. Matanivusi Resort, also on the coral coast of Fiji. Wave Park Mentawai, in front of the Hideaways break in the northern part of the Mentawais, is a long-standing member and helped us to develop the program, was part of the pilot program. The Turtle Bay Resort in Hawaii has been a certified resort for a while as well.
Okay. All sound like stuff that most surfers are probably familiar with, at least to an extent. When you certify these resorts as sustainable, you check to see that they're compatible with 140 different measurements of sustainability. Far too many to discuss here, but what are one or two of the things that you measure when you're certifying a resort as sustainable that our average listener might be able to grasp really easily?
So I think, some of the more obvious things are what people maybe think of when they think sustainability, which are environmental measures. So how is power being produced? How is waste being dealt with? You drill down into those kinds of issues fairly deeply. Other things that may not be as obvious, and really sustainability involves a lot more than just environmental impacts. We would look at things like how much are your staff being paid and what proportion of them are coming from the local community in terms of numbers and also in terms of the percentage of payroll. And that will influence the level at which you would be certified under those particular criteria. Where is your food coming from? Does it come within a 50-kilometre radius or a 90-kilometre radius? Are there opportunities given to learn about local cultures and the local environment so that you can become invested in where it is that you are in ways that might cause you to behave differently, to perhaps contribute either in a physical or a financial sense to the conservation and well-being of local communities and environments? Reef conservation is important in a lot of our destinations that are reef breaks. So is a resort or the boats that service that resort, are they using moorings if they should be? Or are they just dropping anchors on reef day after day after day after day? A mooring goes into a reef once, and it's usually held in place by a reef pin, which is drilled into a reef and stays there on a permanent basis. An anchor is held in place largely by the weight of the chain that's attached to an anchor. And as a boat rotates around its anchor with changing tides and wind conditions, it creates, it drags across coral. And if you've ever put your foot on coral, and hopefully you haven't, it's very brittle and it snaps underfoot immediately. The anchor chain is doing the same thing and will create a circle of destruction around where the anchor itself has gone down. It's also not uncommon for an anchor to get stuck in coral, and maybe you've seen images, there are plenty on the internet of boats with large chunks of coral attached to their anchor as they pull it up. Now, resorts may have multiple boats visiting multiple breaks multiple times a day. Each time that anchor goes down, it's causing damage to the reef. If you have a mooring, the damage is once, it's very isolated, and the boats tie up to that day after day, and multiple boats can tie up to a mooring. So it just saves a whole lot of the damage.
Now, this is a real interesting example of how just general folks like me could stand to be educated more about how surf resorts can be more sustainable. For example, I went on a scuba diving trip to Belize a few years ago, and just as you're talking about this now, I'm recalling how the people who ran the dive boat would jump off the boat and actually swim down and find the mooring, which I didn't know was called a mooring at the time, and they would secure the boat rope to that mooring to keep us in place while we were scuba diving. Now, at the time, I didn't realize that they were doing a service to the environment. But now talking with you, I realized that I could have noticed that back then and appreciated it. So I think that even as you're talking about this now, there's a lot of ways that your average traveler can stand to be educated about this type of a thing.
Definitely. And I think, what we hope to do with the Stoke certification is not just provide a systematic way for resorts to understand what sustainability looks like and how to implement it, but also to educate the market about what to look for. Really what will result in a great deal of changes when the market understands and demands what these things are. It would be great if people who are going on a trip to Fiji, for example, would look at the resort's website or make a call and say, are you guys using moorings? Did you install the moorings, or are you using somebody else's? In Fiji, the Tavarua resort was the one that put the moorings in the breaks in the Mamanutha group of islands. Other people were sometimes tying up to their moorings but hadn't invested or put the time or care or effort in to doing that, dropping anchors on coral reefs over and over again. Same in the Mentawais. The wave park Mentawai resort was the resort that created a non-profit called the Mentawai Mooring Movement to put in moorings all around there. It's really quite a travesty that so much tourism has gone on in that island chain for so long, and there hasn't been a comprehensive effort to put moorings in at all of the breaks that require them. Now, not all of them do. There are some places that have sand bottom anchorages where this is not a problem. But then when the boats go to drop surfers off, generally that's going to be over coral, and each boat has its own tender that services the boat, and those are dropping anchors on coral all the time as well.
Wow. So there's this word that we've already thrown out several times, sustainability. The last time that you and I spoke, you pointed out that there's a difference between all these words that get thrown out in daily conversation, like sustainable versus green versus environmental. What do each of those words mean in your mind, and how are they different? And why is sustainability the term that you use and not green or environmental or the myriad of other ways that people use to describe these types of things?
Sure. Well, I think, some of these words are overused and overblown and oversimplified. So words like eco, green and environmental, I think, can probably all be lumped into the same basket. And when people talk about those, they're thinking about environmental performance. And that's great and extremely valid. It's also probably the easiest thing for the tourism industry to deal with because it equates to immediate cost savings in almost every way that it can be implemented. So this is where you get the international hotel chain saying, we encourage you not to wash your towels every day, and then claim to be great environmental performers. What they're actually doing is cutting their laundry budget in half, which is great, and that's how sustainability should be, but it's not the full gamut of what sustainability means. It also implies social and cultural sustainability, so that you're protecting and encouraging local cultures and the flourishing of local societies and people and communities, as well as economic sustainability, not just for the business in question, but also for the area in which that business operates and for its supply chain. So there's really three facets. The environment is just one of them. And as someone who teaches sustainability and thinks about it a lot, this is kind of one of my pet peeves, that sustainability gets used interchangeably with eco, green, and environmental. That's 1/3 of the equation.
Do you find that, I mean, for people out there who want to become savvy to this kind of thing, do you find that eco, green, environmental, are these generally just marketing terms most of the time, and the word that people should really be looking for when they're making purchasing or travel decisions is sustainability?
Not necessarily. I mean, yes, they are marketing terms, and I think that's why some of the businesses and organizations that are involved in the space use them, because they're recognizable as that. But it also makes it easier for people just to look at the environmental performance. And again, that's one of the areas that is extremely important, but it's 1/3 of the equation.
I see. And regarding sustainability in surf resorts, is there like a shining example that people should look to for inspiration? Is there maybe one resort that comes to mind that across the board does an outstanding job of being sustainable?
Currently, our highest rated sustainable resort is the Matani Vusi Resort in the Coral Coast of Fiji. I wouldn't say that there's kind of the one resort that does everything absolutely perfectly. They're our highest performer at the moment. And they improved recently because they made a large investment in renewable energy. A lot of resorts have traditionally felt hamstrung by a reliance on diesel generators because of the remoteness, and which leads to issues of maintenance for relatively high-tech renewable energy projects. But they've pulled the trigger and done that. There are other resorts like Tavarua, for example, which is working on those areas and is transitioning to 4-stroke engines, which use a lot less fuel and pollute a lot less, but they're in that transition process. But where they excel is in their relationships with their local communities, which go back generations now, and which involve building more than 40 homes for local communities, putting electrical power on for multiple communities, building churches, police outposts, sponsoring school children, paying school fees, paying for medical insurance for their staff and their families, flying people out to the United States.
Wow.
They don't like to blow their trumpets so much, and that's kind of where we like to come in. There's a certain level of humility amongst, I guess, some of the surfer population who do these things, and they do great things, but they don't like to talk about it because it may seem to come across as bragging or chest beating. But they do an outstanding job and have 100% compliance rate at the sustainability and best practice level in some of these criteria that relate to their relationships with communities and culture.
So I'm absolutely not going to ask you to name, the really bad examples of surf tourism out there, but consider, if you can, a surf resort that maybe suspects that they could have some room to improve when it comes to sustainability, or maybe they're even aware of the way that they're negatively impacting the environment or the socioeconomic situations around them. I mean, you mentioned solar power panels. I mean, that's a pretty expensive thing to put in place, it seems like. What are some quick wins that surf resorts could have? Maybe 1 or 2 or 3 things that surf resorts could do that are relatively easy that would let them see big payoffs, not necessarily when it comes to money, but in their ability to more sustainably impact the environment and the social situations around them. Because it seems like once you give a surf resort a quick win and let them see a positive result that they didn't necessarily have to bend over backwards to achieve, that could maybe create more momentum for them to tackle the bigger issues.
Yeah, I mean, there's no real one-size-fits-all answer to that question, unfortunately. Each resort has its own particular challenges in its own geography and cultural setting. So for some resorts, it might be working on their relationships with local communities. For many, it's taking a look at their supply chains and trying to localize that as much as possible, which will end up with cost savings, with better relationships with the communities, with tracking the money that comes and keeping that localized. In a lot of cases, a higher quality and fresher produce that will result in higher levels of guest satisfaction. I mean, in some places it can be, speaking of bad examples, for example, I was in Bocas del Toro a few years ago. I took one of my sustainable surf tourism study abroad classes there, and one of the accommodations we were staying at was expressing an interest in becoming certified. But on kind of closer investigation, it became rapidly apparent that many of the staff working in there were working in inverted commas, guests who were from overseas, didn't have working permits or visas, weren't being paid, were working in exchange for accommodation at the expense of local jobs. And further on scratching the surface, that many of the locals weren't on contracts and weren't being paid the minimum wage locally either. Mm-hmm. So thinking about those things and ensuring that these businesses are legal, these are deal breakers with us. In my view, and in the view of anyone who thinks about sustainability and tourism, you have to be a legal tax-paying entity and paying a fair wage in local terms to your staff. Otherwise, you're not operating in good faith, and that can be a stumbling block for a lot of places that are maybe taking advantage of lax enforcement of these kind of rules. But if you're going to be a good global corporate citizen, then you need to play by the rules.
So in general, it sounds like every environment that you go into and every surf resort or surf accommodation that you deal with has a very different set of circumstances. How do you appeal in general to people to become more sustainable in the way that they run their surf resort? Do you try to sort of give them that moral, ethical pitch about how they'll sleep better at night, or do you actually try to show them how the bottom line improves? What's your general way of convincing folks who don't already want to become more sustainable that they should?
To be honest with you, we haven't done that yet. We've been working to date with people who we feel are committed to sustainability. So for the last 3 years or so, we've really been refining the standard with people who we consider to be good faith operators. We're at a point now where we're about ready to open that a little more broadly, but we're not really going to be going into places that we feel aren't good operators and trying to make the case for them as to why they should become good operators. We're more in a position where we would appeal to places that see the benefits of sustainability for one reason or another, whether that's initially for marketing purposes or whether it's more of a gut level, we need to be doing the right thing, and then showing them what that involves and how we can help them to achieve that. We hope to influence the market, as I mentioned earlier, by informing the market about what sustainable tourism looks like and what they might expect from a resort, and that in the hope that they might shop around for that or look for a Stoke Certified logo and choose those kinds of accommodations over ones that aren't at that level. And then hopefully all boats will rise with the incoming tide and will become unnecessary in 10 or 15 years.
It sounds like a very hopeful position to find yourself in, seeing that so many surf resorts come to you for help and for guidance. A lot of times when you drop in on conversations about sustainability or the environment, there's a lot of doom and gloom, kind of the Yvon Chouinard way of looking at things, where he runs Patagonia in a very sound, ethical way, but he'll also come out and tell you that he thinks in the long run we're screwed. It sounds like there's a lot of that just must be a very great position for you to be in, to not have to be pitching everyone on why they should be sustainable. There's already people out there that want it and are working towards this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and the co-founder of Stoke, Carl Kish, who is more concentrating on our snow resort side of things, we share the opinion that our particular sports and the things that we love to do are particularly dependent, again, to hype the environmental side, I guess climate change is a real threat to the sports that we love to do. There are other things, the tourism that we engage in to go to the places where we love to surf can destroy local cultures and societies. So I think it's incumbent on us to try and change that. And we need to at least get our industry on board and performing maximally. And I like to think that that could seed other folks to change the way that they do things as well. Surf tourism in particular has been a colonizing form of tourism pretty much wherever it goes. Surfers are finding waves which happen to be in beautiful places. Surfers go, a tourism industry emerges. The tourism base expands to different forms of tourism. And surfers have really led the way to many beautiful places around the world. If we can influence that in a sustainable way, then I think the changes will be far more profound than just in our niche, which happens to be a $50 billion a year plus niche in surf tourism.
Well, you mentioned $50 billion a year, and you also mentioned global warming, both things that hopefully we can cover on like a part 2. I hope I can corral you into doing one of these again.
Of course.
But in the immediate term, I want to put my head in a noose for a second, put myself on the chopping block as an example. Many of the surf trips I've taken in the past have been what you've called the Airbnb model, where I might go to vrbo.com or I might go to airbnb.com and I might find a condo or a home that I can rent for a week or two near a surf break. You've called this model bad. Why is it bad? What do people like me or others who do this Airbnb model of surf tourism need to understand about that type of surf travel in your mind?
Well, look, it's obviously a convenient way to travel, and it doesn't make you a bad human being.
Thank you.
What I would critique is that model of tourism and how it benefits local economies as compared with more standard forms of tourism. For the most part, particularly where people are coming from developed countries and going to less developed countries, a lot of these transactions are taking place outside the borders of the country that you're visiting, and the money never makes its way there. So you're not paying taxes. You're certainly not paying the taxes that are normally levied on the tourism industry at various levels in different countries. Somewhere between 7 and 15% tourism industry is being taxed for the pleasure of being the tourism industry. That's not happening on those transactions, which means that your stay in that country is not helping to provide the infrastructure needed to sustain the area that you're traveling to. Whereas if you were staying in a formal tourism entity that was paying those taxes, your money is going towards upkeeping the roads, beach amenities, whatever it might be. If you look at the levels of employment that are generated, a house rental isn't employing a full-time gardener or necessarily cooks in the kitchen or people folding down beds on a daily basis. The kind of worker per surf tourist is far lower under those circumstances. The regulations that are imposed on tourism to make sure that there aren't significant environmental impacts, to monitor the numbers of surf tourists coming into an area, none of that is being captured. So it in many cases, not always, but in most cases, it's sidestepping a lot of the taxes. The money isn't going into the pockets of local people at the same rate that it would be through a more standard tourism operation.
So in a worst case scenario, assume I'm going to go spend a week or two in Costa Rica or Nicaragua or El Salvador, and I am going to do that Airbnb model because there just isn't anything else in the surrounding area that I could go to. What questions would I ask of the person who owns the place I'm staying? Like, is there any way that I could at least make sure that I'm kind of having the least amount of negative impact through the Airbnb model of surf tourism? What would I ask the owner of that property?
I mean, you could ask if this property was registered as a tourism entity in the country.
And for people listening, when someone registers a property as a tourism entity, does that mean they're paying taxes?
It would, but I would doubt that you would find a family home that would be in that situation. I think you would find that extremely rare. I'm not an expert in the house rental market. I know Airbnb properties are now being charged a tax rate in the states and cities in which they reside for exactly these reasons. It's had a significant impact on the general hotel industry, who are powerful and have their lobbyists in Washington and other places, which is why change is starting to happen. But it also has a real impact on the bottom line of states and cities who have to upkeep their infrastructure, and they're just missing out. So I'm not sure what the clear answer there is. I think as a traveller in those circumstances, and again, maybe this is your only option, is to think about how you can positively impact the place that you're at. Maybe you go eat at a restaurant rather than packing all your food in from Costco, or buy food from a local market, or take back some handicrafts, or there's a lot of different ways that you can positively influence the places that you visit.
That's a very good piece of advice, I think, because I can think of 3 or 4 times off the top of my head where I've landed in a country and my first stop was Costco before I drove way out into the middle of nowhere and fed and gave myself nutrition for a week based 80% on what I bought at Costco in the main city that I flew into. So I think that's a very good, actionable, easy piece of advice that people can follow. And I think what I'd add to that is a lot of times it's intimidating, say, to land in San Jose, Costa Rica and not speak Spanish and know that you're going to go subsist in a local environment where you don't speak the language. There's a certain amount of security that comes from running to Costco and getting everything you need so that you don't have to deal with local populations in a way that might make you feel nervous or have anxiety. But in my experience, most of that is just abstract fear that isn't really warranted. And the experiences that you have where you do deal with locals, whether it be in a restaurant or a market or whatever, actually become some of your favorite memories of the trip. So I like that. I think that's generally easy for most people to do. I'd like to switch gears a little bit to something really fascinating that you're doing recently, and that is the Surf Park Summit, exploring the future of surfing outside of the ocean. And you've had some involvement with the Kelly Slater Wave Company, Surf Snowdonia, and others who are on the cusp of making surfing something that doesn't have to happen at a beach. And for most of us, wave pools don't immediately seem like they could have bad environmental impacts. But through talking to you a little bit, you've told me ways that they can. Can you give us kind of a worst case scenario for how the growth of the wave pool industry can go wrong and how you're trying to combat that?
Yes, on the condition that the good parts of the story are involved as well. So, I mean,
absolutely,
there's a few different ways that I think sustainability needs to be factored into the surf park industry as it develops and grows, and is really the key reason why I'm interested in it. I mean, you've got to think about environmentally, it takes a lot of power to produce a wave. You think about the way that normal waves are produced. It's a whole bunch of wind blowing over an enormously vast area of ocean that pushes together little particles of water that all join together over thousands of kilometers and then detonate on a shoreline. You've got to do that within, 50 yards, get a wave of a decent size. So that takes a lot of power to do that. How is that power being generated, and how polluting is that? You've got to look at the consumption of water, and the different technologies use different amounts of water. That also relates to the size of the physical footprint of a surf park. Some of them are relatively small, some of them are frankly huge. The Inland in Austin, Texas is a case in point, is a vast body of water. So that can be a problem. Where is the water coming from? Is it tapping into a supply of people which might be dwindled from being used? Is it in an area of perpetual drought like California where that could be a problem? You need to think about those issues. And then it's also worth thinking about the social and cultural components of that, as well as the economic components. From a social cultural perspective, is local culture being reflected in the building and the way that those services are being produced and served? And is surfing culture a part of that? Because that is not written in stone that it has to be. We would prefer people who are going to be learning to surf at these. I think that there are going to be hundreds of these around the world within the next several decades. And that means thousands of people are going to be learning to surf in these. If the history and culture of surfing isn't inculcated into that process, and importantly, common surf etiquette isn't taught to these people, they won't be dropped in on in these pools. They'll have a wave to themselves. They won't understand unless they are taught how this all works in the ocean. And I think it's important to understand the cultural history of surfing to understand how surfing was passed to the world from Polynesian culture, and the spirit with which it was passed on, I think is really important to communicate as well. And then there's the normal kind of supply chain issues that you would have around what products are being sold in these places, are they being sourced locally? Now, there's some really good examples, even though there's only a handful of pools in the world, of success stories here.
So, what are those? Maybe something that Kelly Slater Wave Company has done or Surf Snowdonia has done.
I think they've both got really good angles on a number of these facets. So Kelly Slater Wave Pool was built in a pre-existing artificial water skiing lake. So it wasn't a matter of having a giant impact. It was repurposing something that was already there. In terms of power, it's being completely powered by solar power. Surf Snowdonia was built on the site of a pre-existing but defunct aluminium smelter. So the soil there was completely contaminated and unusable. And in fact, they got government rebates to rehabilitate that land. It is powered by a hydro power station. The water is naturally occurring in the hill behind them. The water that they use in the pool is diverted from the hydroelectric plant, so it's not coming from a natural water source. It's coming from the power plant into the pool. And because that facility was put there, it gave the opportunity to refurbish the hydroelectric power plant, which was scheduled to be shut down to not only serve the surf park itself, but the surrounding community. So it was a big win for the whole region in terms of renewable power.
So this sounds like there's we're off to a great start, it sounds like, in terms of sustainability in the wave pool industry, and you're trying to keep that momentum going, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's probably more that can be done as well, particularly in terms of how do you inculcate local culture and the culture of surfing. It's one of the more exciting things about this. If there are going to be hundreds of surf pools in areas that are remote from coastal regions, how do we turn those people into activists for the preservation and conservation of marine environments? I think that it is entirely possible, if it's done right, to link that surfing experience outside of the ocean and use it as a teaching moment to get people to care about the ocean and marine environments. In terms of localizing supply chains, I think Surf Snowdonia is really the first commercial surf park, has done a really great job. If you go there, all the beer's local, all the food on the menu is local, and it's an exciting thing to know that you're eating fresh local stuff that's been produced by local people. At least I find that stuff exciting, and therefore it's supporting the local community, not just through the park itself, but through all of these related components of the local economy.
It's interesting to hear you say making people who use wave pools advocates for the marine environment. That's very powerful. I think human beings respond to their own self-interest, and the thing that resonated most with me from what you just said is I don't really want everyone learning how to surf in Colorado, having waves to themselves, have no idea how priority works in the lineup, and then have people coming on surf trips to California or Hawaii or wherever having no clue how priority works next to a peak. So I understand now there are probably a lot of ways that creating wave pools can serve to not just create people who are advocates for the marine environment, but really preserve the surfing experience for what it is in a lot of great ways that you just mentioned. I want to start tapering us down here a little bit. Your personal interests as a surfer seem to align perfectly with your work and your travel life, and a lot of people would view that as success. What advice would you give, say, to a student of yours that wanted to end up in a similar place to you, where their work life and their personal interests kind of seamlessly interact with each other in this way?
I think having courage and imagination to put the dots together in ways that maybe people haven't put the dots together before, according to the things that you're interested in. It's not a coincidence that the things that I'm interested in are reflected in what my job is, because I created the job around the things that I'm interested in. Now, there wasn't a position that I came in to fill other than being a professor at a university. The things that I research in the Centre for Surf Research were entirely by design to provide an outlet for this work that I liked and wanted to do. And I think that there's lots of different ways for people to be able to stay close to their passions, particularly when it comes to things related to, we're talking about surfing, so people who are surfers, there's so many different ways to remain close to the sport and have a positive impact in the world on the environments that we like to be in and the types of things that we like to do. It's just a matter of being creative about it and seeing pathways and putting dots together in ways that haven't necessarily been done before. I would suggest that your own career is kind of an exemplar of that, where you are managing to stay close to the sport and its culture and not in the ways that we might ordinarily imagine.
Do you find that there's maybe a cutoff? Like, for example, for someone who's one of your students, maybe they're 18, 19, 20, 21, you can give them that kind of advice. There are also people who may be 24, 25, 27, 28, who maybe studied one thing in school and became a banker and realized, oh my goodness, I've missed the plot. I need to somehow pivot. How late into one's life do you think you can get creative like that and create something new? Is it ever too late, or is it not? I mean, assume yourself as an example with the Center for Surf Research. Could you have been 32 and started the path then and ended up in a similar place that you were happy with, or do you think it has to start sooner?
No, I don't actually believe that it's ever too late. My particular path, I didn't really have my first job as an academic until I was in my early 30s, so it didn't really start until then. The kind of formulation of those ideas took place through my 20s and into my early 30s, but weren't really ever activated until that point. So I think there's people all over the surfing world who've gone down that path of pursuing careers that didn't fulfill them, who make a bit of a pivot. And maybe part of that is having a certain level of financial security that allows them to take some risks or do something different, or have a business on the side that facilitates that. I know a number of people who've been successful in their original pursuits and then went on to invest in a surf charter boat or a surf resort or some other facet of surf tourism. I mean, those are the areas that I look because that's what I study, but there's any number of different ways, I think, to pivot and change career to something that's closer to your passion that makes you want to get up in the morning and do it again.
There's a question I want to ask you, which I love asking people, and it's kind of a fun way to send off the interview, I think. And I didn't tell you ahead of time I was going to ask you this question, so it'll be fun. Anything we've missed, anything that you'd like people to know about, or do you have any general ask for our audience? Anything you'd like people to think about, or any idea you want to leave them with before I ask you the question I want to ask you to wrap up?
At the risk of sounding a little preachy and boring.
Take that risk.
Okay.
Go.
I think we as surfers need to think about what the impact of our passion and our sport is, and what we can do to turn it around to become a more sustainable trajectory. Because until very recently, we've participated in our sport by riding on chunks of toxic waste, dressed in wetsuits also made from toxic waste.
Wow.
None of that really being recycled or reused. Going into landfills, going on surf trips on our worst behaviour, and impacting badly on the places that we travel to. And none of that really has to be the case. And there are more and more emerging alternatives from the work that Firewire has been doing to reduce the carbon footprint of its product to truly sustainable surfboards that have cradle-to-cradle ideas built into them and are used from renewable materials, and not all of those from natural sources. There are some real advances being made in the kind of chemical side of the industry as well to make things renewable, to these surf tourism options where people can actually make sustainable choices. If we vote with our wallets, then things will start to change. But that's going to require educating ourselves a little bit about what the alternatives are. And thankfully and luckily, there's a lot of alternatives emerging. There's plenty of them out there. It'd be nice if we were mindful about them.
It's an exciting time to be alive with all the changes that are going on, not just in surfing, but in the greater scheme of things. 15 years ago, you and I couldn't have had this conversation. We couldn't have created a podcast. No one would hear it. Now here we are. I want to send you off with this. This can be a fun answer, a serious answer. It can be anything that you want it to be. Tonight, you can go home. You can have dinner, hang out, and before you go to sleep, you can whip out your phone and send a text message that will reach the phone of every person on the planet who has a phone. What text message do you send out? What would that say?
Good Lord, that is an interesting question.
You could just send out, "Good Lord, that is an interesting question," and really confuse people.
I think that would be a waste of that text message. Maybe as an academic, I'm overthinking.
You have all the time in the world. I'll take a sip of water.
Yeah,
What do you think?
do it. I think I would encourage everybody to become a surfer and then go stay at a Stoke Certified surf resort. I think that, that would create horribly crowded lineups. But I think that surfing has the power to bring people in close contact with nature. There's really no other sport that literally immerses you in the environment to the point where 2 hours later, I'll be bending over to pick up a term paper and salt water will drip out of my nose under the desk of a student. Our environment is inside of our bodies and comes out. We're the canaries in the coal mine for the health of marine environments. We literally die when there's shit in the water. And if people could get more of that, and I think feel the stoke that we get from riding bands of energy moving through the water, that perhaps that might open people's minds a little bit to the health of those environments and what they can do about them. And the more that we can create markets that support innovative change for sustainability, the better off everybody's going to be, assuming we don't have 10 degrees of climate change in the next 100 years and sink 50 feet below the water. At least my house will be beachfront property then.
Jess, I hope we get to do this again, and I hope that when we do this again, we're not doing it at your beachfront property house. I hope we do it here.
Okay, sounds good.
And that is it. You have just been a part of episode 1 of the Wire podcast. Thank you for joining us. And now I'd like to know what you think, and so would the rest of us at Firewire. You can give us your thoughts on Instagram at Firewire Surfboards. You can tell us who you think a fun guest might be. You can give us ideas for future episodes, and you can tell us anything else that's on your mind. Maybe tell us how the waves are where you live, because today in Carlsbad, California, there are no waves at all. One more thing before I go. If you want to hear first about future episodes of the Wire podcast, you can join us at firewiresurfboards.com/the-wire. That is firewiresurfboards.com/the-wire. I'm Chris. See you next time.